Hello, my friends. This is Deepak again, and we have a wonderful interview coming up with Samara Bay. This is part of our conversations with luminaries, influencers, and people who are making a difference and helping other people achieve their full potential. So, today, my very special guest is Samara Bay. The book is called Permission to Speak: How to Change What Power Sounds Like, starting with you. Samara, I've been going through the book. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, very delighted. And I had a lot of questions that I can ask you later. But let's start with your personal story, which was very fascinating to me, that you lost your voice and that triggered a whole series of changes in your own life and ultimately in you becoming an expert on how people can find their own voice. So share that story when you were in Providence, I think.
Yeah, thank you. It's one of those stories that I only realized in retrospect, of course, was the origin, right? But I was in my early 20s. I was in graduate school. I was getting an acting degree. And over a few months, I started to lose my voice. And it was painful to the extent that I stopped talking and kept going to class, dropped out of the play, stopped singing, but kept going to class like a ghost, because, when you aren't expected to speak, no one pays any attention to you. And it was a bizarre era. And I remember it was marked with a lot of like late night tea and existential angst, wondering what is happening here. I was not sick. Like there was no obvious reason. And I finally got myself to an ear, nose, and throat doctor. And I now know this is not entirely uncommon, but I had a scope, a little tiny camera put up my nose and down the back of my throat. And I saw an image of my vocal cords. And it was clear from that I had vocal nodules that were forming. It turned out it was from habitually speaking just a tiny bit below my body's optimum pitch. But I didn't know that. All I knew was I had these nodules. And the most memorable part of this whole experience, besides learning how to talk again afterwards, which actually was pretty low drama, the most dramatic moment was when I got back to class. I had missed the morning session, and the gentleman who ran the entire program stopped everything. He turned to me, everybody turned to me, and he said, "So, what's the diagnosis?" And I said, as audibly as humanly possible through these inflamed vocal cords, "Vocal nodules, I have to go on vocal rest." And he said, yeah, just as I thought, bad usage." Which was so odd, right? I mean, it's not a phrase that has much significance in our culture collectively, but I felt it. It was obviously that he was shaming me, that I was supposed to take on that this was self-sabotage. And I didn't know what to do with that. Like, you're not just the victim here, you're also the perpetrator. And I realized this story was of as much significance as it was, because many, many, many people get told, often well-meaning, comments about their voice. You talk a little too high to get taken seriously. You use like too much. Your accent is too thick. And we don't know what to do with it on a practical level. Like, how do I fix that? But we also don't know what to do with it on like an existential level, because that sense of shame or embarrassment or self-sabotage often comes along with those comments and sticks around.
So basically, you use this adversity, if I may call it that, to find your own power, to find your own voice, and now you're helping others do that.
Well, I realized through working with a speech pathologist and finding my way back to the land of the living, right, to speaking, that I had been speaking a tiny bit below my body's optimum pitch. And why was an interesting question, right? I mean, of course, we can all pick up a habit, but why might it have served us? In fact, linguists will say every vocal habit any of us have, we have for a reason. It has served us in some way. So why did me, as somebody in my early 20s, speaking a tiny bit too low, why might I have picked that up? I can only imagine that it was because I calculated truly below the level of conscious thought that I come across as smiley, as warm, as young, and that perhaps if I drop my pitch down, I might cut through any perception of naivete and have a better chance of getting taken seriously, or in the context of this conversation, get more power. And I made that calculation, and many people make that calculation. And so I'm curious, what is this sound of power that we're all chasing?
Do you think, though, that how we are exposed to language and the accents we hear and what happens in our first few years of life, who we're talking to and how they speak influences the way we speak?
Deeply,
Deeply.
deeply,
Yeah.
deeply, to such an extent that I've named it our voice story. Our voice story is not the same as our plot-driven story of our life. It's the collection of truths and non-truths, myths, beliefs that we've absorbed, as well as direct comments most of us have gotten about our voice during formative years, including things like your laugh is annoying, or you talk too much, or you're too much, or
Talk
you don't
loudly or not soft enough or whatever.
right, or the opposite, right? A lot of people have gotten like, you're too soft spoken, why don't you speak up for yourself? And then we sort of fall into these archetypes that feel like there's some ingrained sense of our identity, when of course, as you suggest, some massive percentage of it is environment, is what for everybody listening, what was the soundscape growing up? How much were emotions considered, welcome versus repression was encouraged? I mean, these things are really practical, and they happen on a daily basis in our houses when we're little, and then we learn, okay, so that's how to be.
Also influenced by the cultural conversation going on in that period of history or time or whatever.
I mean,
right?
look, when women run for office and the word that gets thrown around in the media is shrill or overambitious, you have to believe we're
or melodramatic.
melodramatic, manipulative if they get emotional, right? We have to imagine, we don't even have to imagine, we can feel that we are taking in that story. And on some level, we can, of course, become more conscious of the biases that are at play there. And that's certainly a goal of mine. And on some level, we aren't always conscious of the biases. We see shrill and we think the last thing I want to do is be called shrill. What can I possibly do as I go into my corporate work environment tomorrow to not be shrill? And those conversations are happening inside all of our heads every day.
My very special guest today is the author of Permission to Speak, How to Change What Power Sounds Like, starting with you. The author is Samara Bay, and Samara coaches rising business leaders, political hopefuls, and public figures who need to speak in a voice they recognize as their own to truly make waves. She runs workshops and speaks at organizations around the world to support a new diverse sound of power. In Hollywood, she helps movie stars integrate good acting with good accents and has coached clients including Gal Gadot, Pierce Brosnan, Penelope Cruz, Ricky Martin, Terry Crews, Rachel McAdams, Angelica Houston, Ruth Negga. Maybe I should take some coaching too. So anyway, now let's get to the practical aspects of this book. Because we have a certain time limitation on some of the channels that this will be shown on, and because also I want people to actually buy the book and read it, what I thought is, let's go over each of these chapters and have you make one or two comments on each of these. How's that?
I love that. And I do want to put a little pin in your joke, because I am very curious if you're interested in sharing what your own relationship to your voice has been. Of course, you are an example of what I call the new sound of power, right? People who don't sound like quote unquote power has traditionally sounded, by which I mean, in many cases, the straight, rich, white male sound that we can pretty easily point back to the Greeks. And when we hear somebody speaking in a way that is different, whether it's about an accent or it's about a more playfulness of style, or it's about something surprising. It's a gentleness, perhaps, a love forward approach, right? A humanist approach. I like to really name it because so many of us keep these shoulds in our heads of the people that we could point to that do embody the old style. And those shoulds keep us comparing ourselves to them and playing small when we get the chance to speak in public. We need to remember that there's all kinds of new voices around us.
Yeah, so in my case, actually, it's very simple. When I was about, say, 5 or 6 years old, my mother would have me sit on her lap before bedtime, and then she would sing to me mythical stories. And then in the middle of the story, when everything was going wrong, what we call a cliffhanger, she would stop. She would stop and she would say, "Now I want you to dream up the rest of the story. And tomorrow morning, I want to hear the rest of the story. And it better be a love story, because the purpose of speech, her words, is to create joy in the listener." That's all she said to me. And the purpose of speech is to create joy in the listener. Make sure that every story you talk about is a love story, and make sure that it ends happily. That's it. And, that was my training as a 5-year-old kid.
That is so profound. I realized in the writing of this book, which is inevitably about our relationships to our voice, to feeling whole in public, and to this old-fashioned term, public speaking, that in a way what we're talking about is taking back, reclaiming the idea of why any of us speak in public. That old joke about you'd rather be in the casket than giving the eulogy, that joke is funny because we know public speaking is supposed to be terrifying and it is fear-based. I hope they don't laugh at me, right? And that what you're suggesting, what your mother said, what my book is about, is a love-based approach to public speaking. What if we talk about what we care about with a sense of joy or mischief in a way that hopefully makes the care spread?
Yeah, that's all I remember. The purpose of speech is to create joy in the listener. And
And look at you! And look what you've done with that!
I grew up with that one statement. Okay, let's go through these chapters because they're significant and important. So you talk about breathing and all kinds of ways to breathe as a preparation to speech. Just share a few ideas here.
My main gamble with this first chapter is that most of us underbreathe for a reason. We breathe enough, of course, to stay alive, but we don't breathe enough into the messier lower parts of our body underneath our diaphragm, because that's where trauma lives. That's where our deep body wisdom lives, that if we were to listen to it, it would make certain daily concerns feel less tolerable. And I think most of us have a habit, and by most of us, I'm talking to my ideal reader, which really is anybody who feels discomfort with their voice. Often the people who know this on some bone deep level and don't need me to, explain what I mean further, but I'll just name you so you feel seen. Women, people of color, queer folks who present in a way that makes that identity obvious. English as a second language folks, anybody whose accent marks them as other and they know it. And often, sometimes, dreamers and rebels in a space that isn't quite made for that. And the reason I say all this is that I think we all have a lifelong and perhaps generational, multi-generational long habit of holding our breath in those spaces because they weren't made for us. And we are bracing ourselves on some level. So this first chapter on breath is not just about literally breathing, although of course there's some fun exercises in there, but it's also about acknowledging that there are stigmas around public speaking because of the literal public and giving ourselves a massive amount of grace around that.
Interesting. It reminds me of another statement of my mother. And she used to say, what you call speech is the vibration of breath.
Yeah.
All speech is the vibration of breath, isn't it?
It's the vibration of breath. And it's also our thoughts on the inside, finding breath come
Finding.
out.
Okay, moving on. You talk about size, and you talk about something called unspeak and vocal fry.
Yeah. Upspeak and vocal fry. Yeah.
Share with us what that means.
So I'm including a number of different vocal habits in this general category of size to suggest that when we open our mouth to speak, right, when we allow the thoughts to find breath, then there's a whole next level. How do we then say what the thought was on the inside without taking it back at the end? Examples of taking it back: we can go up at the end of our thought. People call this upspeak or uptalk, and it suggests sort of a question mark energy. So for example, instead of saying my name is Samara, I'd say my name is Samara, which, to be fair, suggests it's a strange name. Have you ever heard of it, right? It's doing double duty. But if we habitually get into that pattern, it can really confuse the listener. And I am all about taking a moment to notice the ways in which we demonize certain styles of speech like that, especially when they are feminine coded, and not demonizing them, getting curious. Why would somebody have picked up that habit? How does it serve them? And for anybody who's interested in finding stronger and larger ways to show up, taking the invitation to wonder, what was that doing? How does that kind of an upspeak make me play small or come across as deeply unintimidating? And perhaps that era is over. Vocal fry similarly goes into your throat, so you end up sounding like this. And it's associated with Southern California, where I happen to live. But the reality is the throat, speaking in the throat, is the site for many, many, many people of hiding, of vocal, emotional hiding. And when you do not feel physically or psychologically safe in a space, a fantastic short-term solution is to hide in your throat, and then no one knows whether or not you care about anything. You sound like you don't.
Very good. You talk about pitch. You have a whole chapter on pitch. What's that about?
Well, for somebody who had a medical crisis based on the fact that I was talking a tiny bit lower than my body's optimum pitch, and we're not talking about Elizabeth Holmes levels, right? Really quite small, but it was enough for me to lose my voice entirely. My own attempt to be taken more seriously by lowering my pitch a tiny bit resulted in me losing my voice entirely. And the irony of that is actually quite widespread. When I went back to my speech pathologist, who I had worked with 20 years ago, and asked her about this, she said, yep, young women are coming to me all the time with vocal nodules, with huge problems getting heard, literally, not even metaphorically, literally. And it is always because they are pushing down on their vocal cords and trying to sound too low. But Deepak, if you look up on the internet, if anybody does a Google search, how do I sound more authoritative? How do I get taken seriously? Google will also helpfully tell you 5 bullet points. And the first one is speak lower. That's not just volume, that's pitch. That's if you happen to have a higher voice like this, naturally, not from adrenaline, but naturally, because your vocal cords happen to be smaller, all women everywhere, then the best thing you can possibly do to get taken seriously is to push it down so that you sound like this. And there's an entire chapter on this because it's so nuanced. What I just said is part of it. But then the other part is, for all of us, what does our voice sound like when we've gotten out of an amazing yoga class or had an amazing massage? Our voice is lower. So there's quite a lot to reconcile ourselves to. What voice is the real voice? You know, who are we trying to be? What does a voice that is too high signify? Well, a lot of us, not just women, have a reason for picking up what I call nice voice, right? Or Starbucks voice. It's a customer service voice. Hi, I was just wondering if it'd be possible if you could fill the Splenda up, right? Serves the purpose, actually gets the job done. But if you accidentally get stuck up there, then you're saying, hi, I actually have like the greatest new idea in the world, but I'm putting it up here so that hopefully you think that I'm really nice. And maybe it doesn't get heard.
I was reading some time ago that when a baby looks at its mother uh, before it learns language, uh, what it looks at is first eye movements, facial expressions, but then tone of voice, and can recognize the mood of the mother just by the tone of the voice. Is she happy? Is she grumpy? Is she paying attention? Does she love me? Does she care? Am I accepted? Am I being heard? All that from the tone of the mother's voice. So the tone, in your opinion, reflects, because that's your next chapter after pitch, tone most reflects the mood. Would you say that? I mean, I can listen to somebody on the phone. I can tell if they have a hangover, or if they're in love, or they're frustrated, or they're depressed, all by the tone of their voice.
There's this famous study, Dr. Morabian, back in the 70s, UCLA, that everybody quotes or misquotes about the fact that some massive percentage of what people are picking up on when we speak is our body language. Second most massive percentage is tone, as you say, and the tiniest bit, less than 10%, is the actual words coming out of our mouth. And this is often misinterpreted to mean, what a bummer, our words don't matter. But actually, I offer this instead because of what you just said. The words just happen to be the easiest thing to lie about. Tone tends to tell the truth. Body language tells the truth. If all three of those things are saying the same thing, if we literally get up on a stage and say welcome, and our body is saying welcome, and our tone is saying welcome, and our word happens to be welcome, there is no distinction. It's only when they're telling a different story we will believe your tone and your body over your words. And so in the tone chapter, yes, tone is massively important. Humans also have a massively incredible ability to speak in a range of tones and to hear, to listen and pick up on a range of tones. But what that really means on a practical level is if we want to come across as, say, both strong and warm, which a huge amount of data suggests is what makes for the best leadership, then it's not about faking it. It's not about quote unquote smile more, which many of us have heard, but rather finding our way to a version of strength that we believe in, that we see ourselves in, and finding our way to a version of warmth where we are willing to radiate love, even in a room of people who don't necessarily deserve it, and handling what might come up and getting clearer and clearer. I speak as a parent in that chapter about the fact that on some level, although the Harvard Business Review articles will always say finding the balance between strength and warmth, the balance itself is impossible. I suggest that actually in the moments when people in our lives need us, when our kid needs us, when our spouse is having a rough day, when our friend is going through heartbreak, we show up with that balance perfectly. Strength is, I've got this. I am who you should come to. And warmth is, I've got you. I will hold you in this moment. I've got this. I've got you. And that's leadership. That's it.
A very special guest today is Samara Bay. The book is called Permission to Speak. And we are talking about every aspect of speech that you could possibly investigate, understand, or explore. So the remaining chapters are sounds, words, and heroism. Summarize a little bit about these three chapters.
I
Then
will.
philosophical questions after that.
And oh my gosh, and there was an emotion chapter earlier, chapter 3 as well.
That was an emotion chapter.
It's fine. So yeah, the next few chapters, the final few chapters, 6 and 7, are on sounds and on words. So funnily, by chapter 7 of 8, I acknowledge that there are words that come out of our mouth as well. And the chapter before it, 6, is my one real place to explore my history as a dialect coach. So when I've worked with actors in Hollywood, as well as with business folks who are curious about speaking in an accent that honestly triggers people's biases less. What we're talking about on some level is sounds, and on another level, their life story, their life relationship to their voice, and really how we show up in public like we deserve to be there, regardless of how we sound. So on some level, I'm really interested in the sounds themselves, and on a deeper level, I'm not at all. I'm interested in the sounds. I'm interested in everybody's voice, yours, mine, all of our voices, in so much as our voices are about how we show up in the world, and often how much we are revealing about how comfortable we are in the space, how comfortable we are with how much space we take up, how comfortable we are with trusting our own ideas. And our voice just happens to be an incredible reflection of the answer to those questions. In chapter 7, I get into this really wily space that many people live in when they think of public speaking, how to be articulate. And I offer that, and you and I, of course, are doing this right now, that part of the beauty of human communication is that often what we are talking about is something we have not put to words before. The past, which exists in our mind as images, or our feelings, which exist in our body as sensations, or our hopes and dreams for the future, which we can only hope to find words to construct in someone else's mind what we're half imagining in our own. And if we acknowledge that, it gives us so much more permission to just string some words together and say, do these work? If not, I've got others. And then the experience of communicating is collective, right? It's the listener and it's the speaker, and we're working together. It's the space between us that's sacred, right? It's the language that we're sharing. I'm trying these words out. How does that work? Does that work on you?
Last chapter is heroism.
Heroism. Heroism is my attempt to talk about a bunch of big ideas that are interconnected. One of them is really the answer to why I am doing all of this. I had this wild experience in the summer of 2018 when I was coaching Gal Gadot on Wonder Woman 2. And I was in Washington, D.C. for the summer. And for anybody who's seen the movie, there's a lot of flying. And when she flies, she doesn't talk. So on a practical level, I had a lot of downtime. And that was this wild summer in American history, 2018. We were hurtling towards our first midterms in, that guy's presidency. And we were inundated with the pictures of what was happening at the border. And all of my activist friends were burning out. And it was rough. I mean, I was working on Wonder Woman thinking, wouldn't that be nice if a Wonder Woman could just show up and save the day? But I think we have to save ourselves. And in the middle of that, I got a call from moveon.org, this awesome organization that finds good candidates for office and gives them support. And they asked me if I would be interested in pro bono coaching a bunch of incoming first-time female candidates for office for the 2018 midterms. And I was like, where do I sign up? Tell me what to do. And that changed my life. I had just seen this Venn diagram overlap of two circles. One said, what breaks your heart the most about the world? And the other said, where your skill set lies. And of course, the overlap is what you should be doing. And some version of this, I think all of us have seen. But there was something specific about the language of what breaks your heart the most about the world that really struck me. And I thought, how could anybody figure out the most? And also, if I could, it would point me in some useful direction. Well, that's interesting. And then working with these candidates, I had this aha that what breaks my heart the most about the world is that too often the wrong people are in charge. And we are seeing that play out, of course, in politics, in business, in the news. And meanwhile, absolutely magnificent leaders, rising leaders, future leaders, who are exactly the type of people that we want to have in charge, whose life experience inspires a sense of empathy, as well as skills that are exactly what we need for people to properly represent us. Too often those magnificent people have trouble showing up magnificently in the moments that matter because of this history of standards around how public speaking is supposed to sound. And that I can do something with.
My very special guest today has been Samara Bay. The book is called Permission to Speak: How to Change What Power Sounds Like, starting with you. Please pick up the book. And we've kind of very superficially covered some of the topics in this book. You'll get a lot out of this if you read the book. So now, Samara, I want to move to something else, maybe nothing to do with the book, but my own interest in language ever since I was a child. So, I've been exploring the origins of speech and language almost forever. If you go and look at, how did language evolve, human language, and you go to Wikipedia or all these sources, even Chat GPT, they don't have an answer. They do not have an answer to how language came into existence. And so a while back, I was reading something from some deep historian who said, up until 40,000 years ago, there were 8 different kinds of humans, humanoids, you can call them human species, different 8, just like the cat family includes lions, tigers, panthers, cheetahs. The human family had Homo sapiens, but other species too, Neanderthals, and some people this size, some people that size. They all look like humans, and they all had language, but language was very simple: mating calls, food calls, and danger calls. Then one species, us, Homo sapiens, which is a name we gave to ourselves, the wise ones, we created a language for stories. The first species and the only species that created a language for stories. And then that basically made us the dominant species, because everything we talk about is a story, whether it's money, latitude, longitude, Greenwich Mean Time, scientific models, science itself, culture, music, art. They're all telling a story. So I went back to my roots in India, where there's a goddess called Saraswati, and she's the custodian of civilization, but she starts with speech. And she is telling us that if you want to be most effective, you have to have a story. And it's going back to what my mother used to say, what is the story here? And is the story authentic? Does it have a higher purpose? Would you say that that is what distinguishes us as a species? The ability to use our breath to tell a story.
As a coach, I will say that if that is a useful story for us, each of us to think, then yes. By which I mean, as a coach, right, what I want to know is what works. And this is why actually the book and the conversation that I like to have is framed around this concept of permission. Because for many of us, it's fine for a historian to say, we made it and that other, Homo sapien-esque character didn't, because we can tell stories and they can't. But then, okay, so then what? So does that mean you better tell a good story when you get on that stage? Or does it mean perhaps it is my birthright that I have stories inside of me, that my story, even if I've never heard it told before, is worthy? And this sort of thing sounds cliche, right? We've heard this before, but I work with people every day who know that, but don't really know that. on some level that actually allows them to feel a sense of permission to open their mouth and share their weird story that they've never heard anyone tell before. I mean, there's a reason I tell that story about losing my voice and about that guy saying bad usage, right? The story is not just chronological. It's that line, which shouldn't have any value, was raised to the level of staying with me for years until I ultimately, without realizing it, wrote a book 20 years later that I wished I had had. So stories aren't just, I was born here and then this happened. Stories are, how do I tell this in a way that really highlights what matters to me? And for that, we have to trust that what matters to each of us matters, you know, that it actually is the point that we can trust our own instincts. And this is why I care about quote unquote public speaking, because when we have the chance to be seen and heard at scale, no matter what the scale is, that's when we are really tested. That's when whether or not we are willing to show up whole and coherent in life, to not abandon ourselves, to trust that we are the human experiment right where we are. That's when that test really allows us the opportunity to shine or to get trampled under the shoulds. I should sound like this person. I should not show up so weird. I should be quite generic. And I mean, I think it's also necessary to say that this is a social justice conversation that I'm very, very committed to having on the pages of my book and in these conversations, because inevitably sounding weird feels like a bigger risk for some people than it does for others. And I'm here to hold space for that, you know?
Just curious. I mean, when you look, let's say two people. Let's take somebody like Trump, and then let's take somebody like Obama. Why is Trump so popular? I'm asking, what is it about his voice that he has such popularity?
I don't really want to dignify that, but I totally hear you. It is a completely fair question. I just prefer not to think about him. But I will say this. What a fantastic example of someone who believes themselves.
Aha.
To a perverse degree, we can say from the outside. But if we are hoping to draw some useful conclusion, what a great example of giving yourself permission to speak.
Well, it's an example of actually being true to yourself in a way.
It's true. It's
right?
true. It's true. I mean, I think his entire personality is probably, 75 trauma responses strung together that he's never looked at. But yes, he absolutely shows up in a way that feels coherent to him. And he does totally believe that he deserves to take up time and space. And in some, somewhat depressing but very real way, my readers are just trying to get to some level of that confidence. And confidence means self-trust. And there's all kinds of reasons why we have been taught not to. And the invitation is, if we would like to improve what leadership looks and sounds like in the future, if we want to improve leadership in the future period, what can each of us do today to embody the type of leadership we would like to see more of in the future?
My very special guest today has been Samara Bay. The book is called Permission to Speak: How to Change What Power Sounds Like, starting with you. Pick it up and own your own power. Thank you.
You.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much.